Okay, so since there are barely any seats left, I figure we might as well start. Thank you all for coming. My name's Adam Graves. I'm the director of the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry, which, as you probably know, is MSU Denver's Public Humanities Center. How many of you have been to a DeFi event before? Okay, good. So we have repeat offenders in the house. Yeah, I want to thank all the professors who are here for bringing your students and letting them know about these events. I know we constantly email you and kind of tell you to get out the word, help us get out the word. There is no mechanism, by the way, for getting the word out on our campus other than just sending out personal emails and basically harassing people. So, yeah, so thank you all for coming. It is an incredible honor. Welcome, folks. There are a bunch of seats. I'm sorry. It is really an incredible honor for me to introduce our speaker today, who's not only a former professor of mine, but an advisor on my dissertation committee many years ago, and a really good friend. He's just an incredible person, Jean-Michel Rabotay. Rabotay is professor of English and comparative literature at University of Pennsylvania, where he also co-founded the Slot Foundation and serves as senior curator, which is a really interesting contemporary art space. He's editor of the Journal of Modern Literature, a former trustee of the James Joyce Foundation, and past president of the Samuel Beckett Society. Since 2008, Jean-Michel is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the author of over 50 books, and I'll give you some of the titles that I think you might find interesting. The Ethics of the Lie, which is one of my favorites of his. He's the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Lacan, Jacques Lacan, the famous psychoanalyst, if you're familiar with his work. The Ghosts of Modernity, and Kafka, LOL. Notes on Promethean Laughter. So check out his works. I have all kinds of fond memories of sitting in his seminars at Penn. If I recall correctly, they were scheduled kind of back in the day. They were longer seminars with a kind of an intermission. And during the intermission, the students would just be buzzing with excitement at what's going to come next, because Jean-Michel might reference Descartes and Marquis de Sade in the same sentence, or you name it, Lucretius to Lacan. He's just dazzling as a speaker, as you'll see today. He happily happened to be teaching a course on film this semester, as am I, so we thought it was an auspicious coincidence. And yeah, so he's here to speak on lessons of horror. I should also say, some of you might be familiar with the film Psycho Verite. That is my little modest effort at making a first film that deals with the paradox of the gift. And this is something that Jean-Michel is not aware of, but that first film was in fact inspired by a seminar that I took on the concept of the gift with him in, I think, 2002 maybe, so quite a while ago. So please, warm welcome to Professor Jean-Michel Rabotay.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to be invited by my old friend, Adam. We generally meet in Paris, actually, more often than in Philadelphia or elsewhere, but I'm glad to come to now his hometown, Denver, and I discover Denver with pleasure. And usually when I give a talk, I use PowerPoint. I decided against here because I want to begin with a few ideas that I am testing, I have to say, and it might be a project, but I'm not sure yet, because as we know, as soon as we talk about horror movies or real horror, there are all sorts of ethical questions, and I'll begin with a quote that's a sort of warning, I would say, for myself. It's a book I read not so long ago. Some of you may know it, Joseph de Brexeny, called Crematorium, his memoir of Auschwitz. And this is one little vignette. In June 1944, a Haiti terrifying SS captain visits the camp. He asks the capo to designate the best worker in his team. The worker is called, stepped out from a sort of pit they are digging, stands at attention. Very negligently, quietly, the SS captain takes his gun, shoots him in the head, smiling, and he says, "This is an example, this is a lesson of how even the best Jew must croak." Debreceni comments, "Kitsch, horror is always kitsch, even when it's real." The gripping memoir documents what could be a sort of climax in pure horror, explaining how the Nazi mechanism of systematic killing, dehumanization, and abjection functioned. I will offer a very little vignette next to it that has nothing so dramatic, but I was worried that I might not avoid kitsch. I'm going to narrate a memory that had kept buried for a long time, but it was reawakened not so long ago as I watched in Paris a great horror movie I will discuss briefly later, The Babadook. This memory was there, hidden by images coming from films, generally, films and books. And this is what I will use to explain this idea of lessons from horror. It was in the late 60s. I was a teenager living in Bordeaux, in the southwest of France. The scene takes place early in July. The weather was very hot, as is common at that time. Walking in the center of the city around noon, I reached the central square, Place Gambetta, past a line of people waiting in front of a bus. Suddenly, behind me, an enormous explosion. Turn back, see something I cannot comprehend. There was a woman's body on the sidewalk. The head was missing. Behind a store window had been smashed to pieces. There the head was, among wooden debris and shards of glass. There was blood all over the sidewalk. I couldn't hear voices or noises for a while. Later realized that the explosion had deafened me. The scene in my memory is silent, eerie, frozen. In that silent moment, I focus my gaze on a shiny blob of red matter, human blood, thinking that it looked beautiful when it was hit by a ray of sun. This half hemisphere was of the brightest red. It trembled slightly. By contrast, the horrible vision of the decapitated head looked ugly. That there was an odd detail I will mention later that's not very palatable. Sounds came back, sirens, screams, shouts, people who had been wounded, carried away. Miraculously, I had nothing. Someone said, the bus tire blew out. I was shoved away by the police. No one asked me anything. The case was cleared away. I kept on working. I thought, having read at that time a bit of Camus about the absurdity of life and death. Back home, I tried to tell the story to my younger brothers, who did not believe me. I had already been in the habit of reading them horror stories from stories in English that I'd bought in England, and they thought I had invented this just to frighten them. Again, at dinner with my parents, I explained what had happened. Now, a little, they believed me a little bit, but it was only when the newspapers carried the thing that they believed me. And I learned the name of the woman, Germaine Dutozia, 65, social worker, decapitated by a metal piece inside the bus tire that had overheated. Was this horror, or was this something else? Once my story was believed, it horrified people, but it hadn't horrified me at that moment. Had I felt immune to that horror? In fact, for me, the accident had been reduced to what we call in French a fait divers, news items. I had taken refuge in aesthetic categories. After the blowout, the headless woman looked to me like what I thought was an old peasant woman dressed in black, which was not the case, I learned later. But the blood had functioned like a screen memory. For me, as Freud describes screen memories, it was a true screen that separated me from the unpleasant reality of the thing. And as Freud says in his own example, it's a yellow color. The presence of a bright color betrays that masking function. Soon after, I chanced upon an excellent essay by Roland Barthes from 1962. I recommend it. Structural reading of what is a fait divers. It's left in French. We could translate by journalistic filler. Those sad, bizarre, horrific events that happen commonly while being unconnected with larger issues. Barthes insists upon the idea that a fait divers contains all the information needed for its understanding. I quote, "It refers to nothing but itself. Its structure is made up of pure immanence. It is divorced from political and social meanings. It constitutes a self-enclosed story. Indeed, the only true lesson I might have drawn from my story is that one should check one's tires when the weather is hot." But adds in conclusion that a fait divers hesitates between an arranged causality and pure coincidence. We often say it was fate, in the hope of diminishing random horror. As Barthes sees it, a fait divers has all the requirements for mass art. It is released from responsibility, he says, and it releases us from responsibility. We know that in many cases, good horror stories, good horror films are based upon real-life events. The genius of the writer or director is a certain ability to universalize the story. For instance, let's think of Ed Gein's famous Murders, exploited by Robert Bloch in his excellent 1959 novel Psycho, then turned into a masterpiece by Hitchcock, Psycho. For me, one lesson I gained had to do with shock, speed, and metamorphosis. What had been most shocking was that sudden transformation of a banal scene into pure mayhem. 1 second, a woman was there, waiting for the bus. The next, she was a disfigured corpse. Everyday life had been upended all at once. And we see this in so many horror movies. The quasi-instantaneous metamorphosis of the nice lady into a vampire, smiling girl into a ghost, a zombie, a mutant, the friend who chats with you with a knife ready to stab you. This instant reversibility is not new, but it strikes us as new because we live in sanitized modern lives. Given the perception of our environment, we do not see usually maimed bodies in the street. We do not have to avoid hordes of amputated beggars, as I saw at times in places in Indonesia, or as anyone would when leaving Mass in the Middle Ages. Another lesson for me had to do with the discovery of beauty in the midst of horror. It looks as if I had changed the moral outrage one could experience facing the tragic event, the death of a woman killed in a freak accident, into an aesthetic vision. It might have been that my perception of beauty was a coping mechanism. And then a few years later, working on English, French competitive examinations, I discovered that the term of aesthetics had been introduced in the English language for the first time to translate German terms used by Baumgarten, Kant, and Schiller. This had been done by Thomas de Quincey in a famous essay, Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts. This really hilarious essay established de Quincey's name and gained him a place in André Breton's Anthology of Black Humor. De Quincey explains that any murder has two handles. One can seize the murder by the moral handle, but it is when there is still something to be done. One can seize it by the aesthetic handle, which is when there's nothing to be done. As he says, there is a murder, I quote, "A sad thing it was, no doubt, very sad, but we can't mend it. Therefore, let's make the best of a bad matter, and as it is impossible to hammer anything out of it for moral purposes, let us treat it aesthetically and see if it turned out to account in that way." This is how De Quincey invented the very popular genre today of true crime. His lecture uses a real murderer. He had met him, actually, John Williams, whom he knew lately. And this man had murdered two families, and is called a supreme artist by De Quincey. His unspeakable crimes should be enjoyed as works of art. And they were, on top of that, so gruesome that they set higher standards for murderers to come. The newly defined autonomy of aesthetics entails that any work of art creates its own reality, divorced from ethics, and it includes introducing cruelty and horror. Horror is, in fact, the aim of De Quincey's fantastic recreations of those murders in other texts. Of course, this is a spoof on Kant. De Quincey loved Kant, and he wrote a whole book on Kant, The Death of Kant. And he here discusses, ironically, issues that some of you may know very well. In the third critique, the question of beauty, the sublime, and what is the sublime? It's an object of nature represented in such a way that we question the possibility of our presentation. I will not insist on this analysis. You probably know this, but one of the important factors in the experience of the sublime is that for Kant, by discovering our finitude or impotence or really puny natures, we can go back to the idea that there is in us a certain infinity as far as we consider it as the moral law. We know that someone like Hegel criticized this move, and this is also a long discussion, and Hegel believed that it was a mistake to think that the sublime exceeded representation. For Hegel, nothing exceeds consciousness as long as it is consciousness, but what we discover in the sublime would be an experience of negativity, which is also what he calls an experience of death and murder. This is Hegel's way of talking about negativity in a different manner. I'll use a very funny little essay by Hegel from 1808, who thinks abstractly, to illustrate better this point. Hegel answers to the reproach that philosophers are too abstract. And he says this is wrong indeed. And as an example, he takes his own fait divers. There had been a murder. The murderer has been caught. He's going to be executed. He happens to be a good-looking young man. For the people, one cannot say that he's good-looking. He is bad, evil, and it seems perverse for them to speak of the beauty of the criminal. For the educated people of the city, they have this enlightened approach, and they understand the motivation. They will look at what caused the murder, why. We know that today even the brain can be attacked, and so on. And that for Hegel is not good. It is still abstract thinking. The murder or murderer is reduced to a category. The only person, he says, who manages to kill the abstraction of the murderer and bring him to life for honor is an old woman. The severed head had been placed on the scaffold, and the sun was shining on it. How beautifully, she said, the sun of God's grace shine on Binder's head. This woman saw that the murderer's head was struck by the sunshine and was still worthy of it. She raised it from the punishment to the sunny grace of God and accepted him as the higher sun. This is how Hegel sees how it echoes with my little story. I wish I had acquired such wisdom when I saw my terrible sight in Bordeaux. However, I cannot follow Hegel personally in his theological optimism, because, of course, for him, capital punishment is the way of bringing about a reconciliation of the ugly deed and popular Sittlichkeit, morality. Let me return to Roland Barthes and to this idea that this is the domain of popular culture, and why so much that has to do with cultural cruelty is also a way of absorbing violence today in given all the mass murders and what we read in the news and so on. There's a great book by Maggie Nelson, The Art of Cruelty. I have worked with Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn, who did in Paris a show called Eternal Flame at the Musée d'Art Moderne. But in New York, he did something called Deep Exhalation, and he tried to address this issue by showing horrible pictures that he found in torture porn websites and real life people being blown up in various parts of the world, and splicing in images from sexy advertisements of underwear and so on. It didn't work fully, I have to say. I didn't tell him, but it's what I think he shows that there is a worry, an ethical worry somehow in this kind of popular fascination for something that is repulsive but also keeps on fascinating. So my first filmic example will be from The Babadook, and the plot is simple. It's a single mother who has lost her husband the night her son was born and cannot mourn and cannot celebrate the birthday of her son on the day he was born. And they were speeding on the hospital. The husband was beheaded in a freak accident on the road. And the whole film begins when we see her inability to cope with what Lacan would call the symbolic, give a birthday at the right time. And we learn about this decapitation only at the end, and there is a little detail, and we'll see this in the first clip, that the woman I saw decapitated was not even, I would say, decapitated cleanly, but obliquely, and so there was no connection in a way, and this is something that Jacques Derrida has discussed a lot in his seminar on the death penalty, this French idea that the guillotine offered a clean death, painless, and almost bloodless. So we can watch the first clip of the Babadook, in which we see that the mother who has ingested this monster has been, in a way, taken prisoner by the son. She is in the basement, and the son wants her to just expel the Babadook from her.
I'm not leaving you. Mom? Mom? We said we protect each other. I know you don't love me. The Babadook won't let you. But I love you, Mum. And I always will. You let it in! You have to get it out! I don't want you to go away. No! No! Mommy!
close-up, this first clip, as you can see, she has vomited. It's not bile, as one might think, but it is ink, the ink she has used to compose the book, which tells her that she has to kill the child, and so on. And we are going to see now the second clip a little later, when she has moved up and, in a way, defeats or controls or tames the Babadook, but the Babadook appears clearly as the result of the return of the repressed of her dead husband.
Keep breathing. Put your seat back, sweetheart. 10 more minutes and we're there. I think it's gonna rain.
Stop! You are nothing. You're nothing! This is my house! You're trespassing in my house!
Okay, so this is a great film because we see, of course, the psychoanalytic undercurrent showing us how the Babadook has been produced by her trauma and inability to mourn and inability to recognize the child. The child is going to be 7 and start having classically Oedipal attitudes facing her, and this is what triggers the appearance of the Babadook. But the Babadook here is not destroyed, but tamed and then forced to live in the basement. And then she, at the end, she collects from a garden worms to feed the Babadook. And she tells the son, Samuel, no, you cannot feed the Babadook yet. You have to be a little older to feed it, which is a nice idea about how to live with the trauma without destroying, because nobody can destroy the trauma, but learn to cope with it by integrating it and so on. This is, of course, when I mentioned Freud, there is, as we know in the literature on horror films, a lot that owes to psychoanalysis. And why is that? I wondered, not only because there's a great book by Julia Kristeva, Powers of Horror, but also because fundamentally in Freud we have this very simple idea that given the unconscious as created by repression from our unconscious Oedipal desires, those Oedipal desires are in themselves horrifying. It's this idea of the horror of desire that you find among certain psychoanalysts. And this is exemplified by a dream of Freud in The Passion of Dreams, in which he mentioned a recurrent dream he had when he was 4 or 5, seeing his mother taken away by birds, dead. He would wake up his parents, which was one of the aims of the nightmare. And he realized that the birds were brought about by Vögeln in German, which means to have sex. And so it was an Oedipal dream of having sex with a mother and so on. But this dream that showed the representation of the Oedipal desire was too horrible and became a nightmare. In psychoanalytic theory, and having taken into account the critiques made by Jacques Derrida quite systematically of a certain classical and Lacanian psychoanalysis, I would like to say that for Derrida, the problem of psychoanalysis is that it cannot deal with cruelty and with horror. It doesn't know how to make it work. It would be a long story. I would say that it is important for me to use a term that Lacan has introduced, which is the term of jouissance. Jouissance is more than Lust or pleasure in German, and we see this in one interesting passage of one case of Freud, the treatment of an obsessive-compulsive neurosis, the rat man, the famous rat man. Why called this young man called Lanza the rat man? His symptom was an obsession with the torture, a rat forcing its entrance into the victim's body through the anus. The young man had heard that story during his military service. A cruel officer had told it, and he took pleasure in cruelty, and this horrifies it. Freud forces him to say what it is, and when he manages to talk about the torture itself, Freud writes, at all the significant moments of his narration, a very strange compound expression is visible on his face, which I can only interpret as horror at the pleasure he does not even know he feels. Grausen vor seiner ihm selbst unbekannten Lust. And so this is where Lacan would introduce this term of jouissance that he actually borrowed from his friend Georges Bataille, but we could return to this. And jouissance is what we have in Freud's civilization and discontents, when Freud explained that jouissance can also entail making the others suffer. Freud mentioned that humans need to humiliate, torture, and kill other people. So what to do with this? We think of horror and cruelty. In German, they are closer, somehow, Grausen, Grausam. One of the first, one could say, horror films in German was Nosferatu, subtitled 1922, Eine Symphonie des Grauens, Symphony of Horror. Horror treated as musical stuff somehow. It's indeed a beautiful, beautiful film. And of course, we have to think about what is this object, what is what somehow condenses a certain horror. And I would say that it is the concept of blood. And this is why when we say today film, gore film, I don't want to be too long, but there will be a long semantic analysis. And here I'm alluding to the posthumous work of a philosopher I worked with a long time ago, Jean-Luc Nancy. One of his last books is called Cruor in Latin, and it's all about blood, or the various ways in which blood can be explained. To Nancy as well, I owe to have looked at Hegel in the Philosophy of Nature, who has a long analysis of what blood is. And for Hegel, blood, in a way, condenses the negativity of life as such. One can say that for Hegel, the philosophy of life is a cruel philosophy of life. Life has to pass through death and cruelty and then be reborn. It is something that we have in most horror movies, and this is why one can say that most horror films, when they are good, generally transcend the fascination that could be called perverse or fetishistic, by exploding certain things like the family. And I will just show a very brief section from Martyrs, because this transcendence takes generally the form of the eye of the subject with either the victim or the mystic contemplating something beyond. And we'll see this with just a clip from Martyrs.
À l'instant, je descendais la nourrir, ça fait quelques minutes. Vous êtes certaine? Mademoiselle, comme je vous l'ai dit, je n'ai jamais vu une expression pareille. Elle est relâchée, je veux dire, complètement relâchée. Son visage est comme... Mademoiselle, ses yeux... Je vous jure qu'elle ne voit plus ce qu'il y a autour d'elle.
Mais est-ce qu'elle est toujours...
Elle est vivante.
Here we see indeed it looks like Laugier is somehow following the drift of certain writers like Georges Bataille, ecstasy coming from intense jouissance and the mystical vision of the beyond. However, I can tell you that the ending of the film, we won't see it, denies that possibility. Nevertheless, this is something he is interested in, and he liked the actress because she looked exactly like the famous character of Joan of Arc in Dreiser's famous film, silent film, and so on. So it would be this idea that ecstasy has been, in a way, reached through torture, death, and sacrifice. We see often this in films that have a sort of supernatural component, but not necessarily. And I want to see, just very rapidly, a bit of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We can also the famous moment of the eye of the victim, but it's the victim we know who will escape, thanks perhaps to this eye.
Like a pack of hounds. We were just having fun. You think this is a party?
Please. You can make him stop. No, he can't.
Shut your mouth. Can't be helped, young lady.
Oh, please.
Shut up.
Let them kill me.
No mind. You like this, Dave? Shut up, you bitch hog. These benefits do all the work. He don't like it, ain't that right? You're just a cook. Shut your mouth. You don't understand nothing. I understand you ain't nothing. Me and him do all the work. I just can't take no pleasure in killing. There's just some things you gotta do. Don't mean you have to like it.
Please. Please. I'll do anything you want.
Don't need to torture the poor girl.
Started on that very interesting statement. No need to torture the poor girl. I can tell you, she will escape. She will escape. But if you don't know, you probably have seen it, but we can return to it. She's the final girl. And also now, a film I like a lot by a filmmaker that's fantastic, Patrice Duvaisse, a scene that parodies it or quotes it from The Ordeal. Calvaire in French, better than The Ordeal, as more Calvary.
Mais fais attention, regarde, ça coule partout. Et tu sais, alors j'ai réfléchi. Hein. On va relancer l'auberge. Alors toi, tu chanteras, bien sûr. Et moi, je ferai peut-être la première partie. Je ne voudrais pas vous inquiéter, mais j'ai l'impression que votre baby-foot se fait la malle.
J'ai retrouvé Bella, ma fifi.
C'est formidable, Boris.
J'ai fait comme vous avez dit, monsieur Bartel. Je me suis obstiné et j'ai retrouvé Bella.
Je me suis obstiné, j'ai retrouvé Bella. Alors, buvons. Allez, buvons. Buvons au miracle qui réunissent ceux qui s'aiment à Noël.
Je me suis obstiné.
Et j'ai retrouvé Bella. Oui.
Et vous la trouvez comment?
Mais bien, je la trouve bien. C'est merveilleux.
Oh, ma Bella. Oh, moi aussi, je la trouve merveilleuse. Oh, Pouki. Ma Bella. Mon petit ma fifi. Mon fifi, mon fifi. Ça va, monsieur Bartel?
Mais oui, ça va, mais Bella est rentrée, Gloria est rentrée, on est tous réunis pour Noël. Je vous aime, vous êtes ma famille.
Oh, tu entends? T'entends ma chaîne, on est la famille? Oui, oui. Oh, ma loulou. Ma loulou.
He's just been shot by the party of the villagers who hate them, but then once they kill the other guy, he, who is half-shaved and so on, is again taken by the wife of the leader of the group and so on. So it doesn't end like that. I say that in all these examples we see the eye in a context that is very ambivalent, as you can see. All the perverts and torturers laugh, and you don't know at what they laugh, sort of laughter without any object, laughter of pure jouissance or pure, you could say, beyond. And I'll just conclude by saying that one of the main objects that is debunked by horror movies is the institution of the family, which is, here the family at Christmas or the family in the previous film with the Oedipal context, and even Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the cannibal family, as representing the investment, we might say, in the critique, at least in Martyrs. There is a critical dimension, as we discussed it yesterday, of a critique of a certain moment of the triumph of capitalism and the nuclear family as perpetuating the horrors of capitalism. To conclude, I would say that we are with this idea that the lesson brought by horror movies is closer to the law that Kafka saw his horrible machine see in the penal colony as inscribing on the body of the victim, that is without understanding what it is, what it says, and everybody is guilty anyway. Or perhaps another version is that it is today's modern version of the American Sublime, a cheaper and popular version. It's a sublime that does not elevate the heart, does not lead us back to the moral law, but that irritates the blood, which, after all, is not so bad. Thank you.
Testing. Okay, great. So thank you very much, Jean-Michel. I'm going to kind of run this microphone around during the Q&A just so that, because we're recording the talk, I forgot to make a shout out, by the way, to Horrible Things, who is here, they're here today. It's an organization here in Denver that celebrates these disgusting things. But they're going to be putting it up on their website, and eventually it'll make it onto DeFi's website. That's not to put any pressure on you, but I want to be able to capture the questions so that we also kind of understand the context for Jean-Michel's answer. So, so that said, do we have any guinea pigs? When you get the microphone out, usually people kind of become a little quiet. We can scrap the microphone. I want to hear more about the eyes, because my sense was that in Martyrs, which some of us watched last night, the eye seems to be, quite literally in the film, it's a portal to the other world or something, you know. But it's also this kind of gaze that's reflective of some kind of mystical experience, which I suppose is connected to Lacan's jouissance, some kind of transcendent pleasure through pain or something like that. But in the other clips, the eyes, instead of being transfixed, they were rapidly moving and kind of shaking I was just curious if you felt like if the eye represent if the significance of the eyes in these various clips, if there's something that kind of holds them together, or if you feel like they're being used differently.
In the Vice, it was clearly a quote for aficionados who would have recognized the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But in many other films, you have that moment of the victim's ambiguous enjoyment of her own death, let's say, or ecstasy, as represented not by the wound but by the eye. And so, as you said, the portal, and in Martyrs there is this idea of transcendence, as the sinister Mademoiselle explains, and they want to create not victims but martyrs, people who will transcend pain somehow. So what does that term mean? As I suggested, there is a deflation by the fact that she hears what would be the beyond and kills herself immediately. So not a very pleasant news somehow as being given by the dead, half-dying Anna. But indeed, that's a sort of recurrent theme in many, many horror movies. One that has been glossed a lot, Peeping Tom, in which the killer pierces the eyes with a contraption he has invented because he wants to see the fear on the victim. And the fear is in the eye. So the eye would embody that mixture of fear, but for us, enjoyment, the particular ethically unsound effect of horror movies is we enjoy the fear somehow. And so why is it that we can say it has a cathartic function? This is the usual explanation. We purge ourselves and so on. Or we could say we are more naturally wicked, and it's part of our innate cruelty.
What I really found interesting about your personal anecdote that you began with, is that in contemporary pop psychology, we talk about repression within the context of trauma. So you repress trauma. Mm-hmm. But what the Ratman case study shows, and what your story seems to indicate, is that what's repressed is not the trauma, but actually the pleasure that that's not permitted as a result of in Freudian language, the dictates of the superego or something like that. So what's being repressed is not the pain, but it's the pleasure you get, the perverse pleasure from the suffering that you see. And that's why I think the members of Horrible Things are such terrible people, because I'm just kidding. They're lovable. But it's interesting, right? Because we somehow enjoy watching people suffer on screen. We get some kind of, obviously, some kind of pleasure from that, and it's a kind of a moral question that students in courses, literature and film, have to consider. Why is it that the aestheticized representation of events that we'd otherwise find morally repulsive, why is it that we find them enjoyable in some way? And is it because they perform this function of somehow reconciling ourselves to the pleasure that we otherwise repress? Yes. Okay. Good. Yeah, no, you do need the mic for my purposes.
Okay. So can you connect that somehow to, well, I'm thinking, for example, of a friend of mine that I have that would always laugh if you hurt yourself. And, you know, maybe you'll have this friend, right, who can't help but uncontrollably laugh when someone is in pain. And then also all the comedy in things like Looney Tunes. Because there's a lot of pain in the cartoons, right, where the animals are falling and people, you know, things that would cause death but don't, and we find it funny.
It is Schadenfreude, somehow.
Yeah. Is that just like the acceptable version that you can watch with your children of this?
Yeah, because this is what we have been taught to repress. Mm-hmm. See, the first reaction if you see an old lady sleep on a banana peel is to laugh, and then the parents say, don't laugh. Right. This is sad, this is terrible, and so on. We know, I mean, of course, this is Bergson's famous example, that there is a sort of social cruelty, but it's also a certain negotiation with repression. And I think horror movies allow us to indulge a little more of our jouissance without that repression. With often, I would say, the aesthetic bonus. I'm using a Freudian language. Freud always talks about the premium of aesthetics, but this is what they do somehow. We all have these a sort of tendency to a certain jouissance, and one can say if we follow here Lacan or Slavoj Žižek, who has made a lot of that, jouissance can have very dangerous consequences when it is unleashed as a collective thing. Let's say the Nazi moment has been well documented. That's why I wanted to begin with this, but everybody who's discussed Klemperer, some of you may know the analysis of the Third Reich language and so on, demonstrates how Germany after 1933 had seen a sort of liberation of the people, that suddenly they could do things that were totally morally reprehensible, and they had the scapegoat, the Jews and so on, but not only. So the unleashing of jouissance in that context is scary. And it's better to have it while you are with friends in a movie theater. That's what I would say. Does that correspond to your sense?
Yeah, I'm just liking all the things that it's connecting to, so thank you.
Because we live, you know, more and more in a society that is self-castrating. We know, as educators, we've learned not to use certain words and so on. And we know that this is a sort of cunning of powers that be, that we've seen this, I have seen it a lot in China, where I go regularly. And it's been, in a way, I take the example of China, not to offend anybody here, but in China, the combination of fuzzy rules and sudden disappearances of people who have done something but nobody knows what exactly creates that self-censorship. Here we have our students to remind us we cannot say certain things and so on. But it is, in a way, the same general tendency I see throughout the world, in a way, the way we learn to control not only our base urges, but also our languages and so on, our discourses. And it's not bad to have little outlets, and I think horror movies function, in a way, interestingly, with often this added twist of good social critique. Yes, here.
Hi there. I was thinking about the kind of drive of horror, and that kind of sadism theory assumes that we are primarily identified with the killer. But I think most people that watch horror, your primary identification is masochistic rather than sadistic. And I'm wondering what you thought of. There's a kind of theory that horror movies provide a kind of immersion therapy, that it is triggering yourself in a safe environment that allows you in some ways to control your fear of death. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, mean, this question of identification is complex because it depends how the killer is presented. And at times you do, at times you don't. It's not as systematic as that. And I think this is here the aesthetics of any given film that will allow you to choose certain identifications. I don't think anybody, for instance, who has watched Psycho will identify with Anthony Perkins, for instance, to give a very classical example. He appears as, you first do not understand that he is the killer. You think the mother exists and she kills, but everybody identifies with the victim, for instance. But there are other cases where it's more, I mentioned yesterday a film I like a lot, that really very gory and horrible high tension French film, and in which the killer appears, and it's not clear from the start, but then you understand at the end that the killer, who looks like a sort of peasant man, but always with a chainsaw or various instruments, is a projection of the woman we imagine to be the victim. And when she sees the killer, she's afraid herself. See, so that you can have that split here. And in other cases, indeed, we identify with some killers, but I wonder, like if you take those examples, in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's the famous scene in which you have the paralyzed young man in his wheelchair being, killed. You cannot identify, I think, with Leatherface when he's slaughtering this poor man. It's really the brute force of the monster but we have a certain sense that it's good to be, that's why I liked the way Jennifer Kent treats it with Babadook. What she shows could be a meditation on the way horror movies function. That is, you tame your monsters somehow. You learn to live with them by indulging them once in a while and so on. So you cannot erase from your own psyches all those evil drives and so on. Better know that they are there and keep them somehow in abeyance and know what they do, what they can make you do, and so on, which I think has political consequences, even in moments of like a national frenzy or panic and things like that.
Hello. In your opinion, is there a relationship between horror or the dark side and greatness?
That's a good question, yeah. A little bit, yeah. I have to say, I'm not sure whether it's in exactly that sense that you mean it, but the few people I met, authors, actors, and so on, who were great, had something, I wouldn't say horrible, but monstrous. Yes, if you could say the monstrous and the great, yes. Horror here is, of course, the problem of horror is that it's both objective and subjective. Yesterday, I had a question about Martyr. Somebody asked, is this a horror film, finally? And my answer was to say, if you're horrified, this is a horror film. You don't need to say it is a science fiction or romantic comedy. If it horrifies, it has reached its aim. But in terms of greatness, yes, I think there is generally, we know, a certain ruthlessness in people who achieve greatness that can be a little monstrous, yeah. Thank you for that interesting question.
Actually, can I get Jim, just because we had a question?
Hi, thank you. And if this was an example that happened before, I had got here a little bit late, so I apologize. I'm thinking about the eyeball scene in Kubrick's Clockwork Orange and Kubrick's choice not to include the final chapter from the Burgess novel. He doesn't know as he's making the film, but he does know towards the end of production that there's a chapter that the American version has edited off. So for me, studying ecstasis, it's fairly easy to project people out into oblivion, but the moment of re-entry seems to be, or the re-entry of the ego state seems to be where there's a lot of information. So I'm just wondering if you had thoughts about the Kubrick eyeball, because this is, I think it's operating in a different way than these films, but I want to know what you think about it.
Yeah. I love that film. I love the novel. I think for me, Clockwork Orange is an amazing novel that is even better maybe than the film, although people think the novel is not that good and the film is great. Both are good. And both are horrifying for very different reasons. Because indeed, the film, in a way, stresses the visual aspect, whereas the novel stresses the linguistic aspect and the flow of the kind of invented language with a lot of Russian and so on that justifies, as it were, the crimes of Alex. And in the film, it is, I think, based on a sort of very bad idea of therapy, which exists, actually, we know in the US, in which, you know, when you have people who have a phobia, let's say they cannot see a snake, they are forced to touch a snake every day, and then they will learn to control the phobia. We know it doesn't work. So it's the same idea, sort of parody, I think, of a wrong twist on therapy. You will be forced to see the horrible things you have done, and you will control your sexual urges and so on. I think what Kubrick suggests is that it's a failure. I don't know whether you would agree with that. That's not the cure somehow. And so it's, I think, within the medium, the visual medium of film, interesting to be reminded that our eyes are like this. Or at times we want to close our eyes when there are things that are a little too gruesome, but then we reopen them. So, yeah, thanks. There was a question. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, ask. We're going to do 2 rapid questions before we have to.
I wanted to know if you've noticed a general decline in horror movies adding an element of humor into the... It seems like the movies from a couple of decades ago had a lot of stereotypes that would make you kind of laugh while you were watching the humor.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question because indeed, many times, one horror movie for one person will be a funny film for another. Like, I don't know, but some among you here may have seen that, but for some is a sort of culmination of horror, The Human Centipede, in which you have a deranged doctor whose great idea is to transform 3 human beings into one by grafting the face of one into the anus of the second, and so on. So they will eat and digest all together, as you can see. And the result for me is a funny film. It makes me laugh every time I see it, but maybe it's my sense of humor. I know people who hate it and so on. And I think part of the idea, and it became a franchise, is that it's so absurd that it pushes itself. You saw in the examples here, like the family of Leatherface making fun of the horror they create, imitating it, and so on. There is always that in horror, and I think it is because it goes back to the earlier examples of the uncanny, because the horror has something to do with the uncanny, and if you know Yench's famous essay on the uncanny, he gives us an example of the uncanny. First example, the explorer who goes to Africa sits on the trunk, and then to his horror, the trunk is a crocodile or a snake. So is this horror or is this a funny story? It depends how you show it. You could make it into a funny story. You can make it into a horrible story.
So I'm wondering, how do we account for the fact that most horror movies show a female victim suffering? And is there something essentially different when the victim is female, or is it say something about us, or how do you explain this?
I mean, we talked a little bit about this yesterday about Martyr, because in Martyr, the woman who is behind this weird cult explains that women are better as victims than martyrs. Laugier, we know, had a long theory about this that he explained in various interviews. He thinks that women have always been represented as the victims and so on. Okay. At the same time, one should distinguish, I think, between women and women here. It's not so easy to gender, and I would take simply the example of Marquis de Sade. In Marquis de Sade, most of the victims are women. They're all indistinguishable. They're all beautiful, young, shy, and horribly violated, and then often killed. But many of the libertines are women too, and they are different women. So one cannot say it's just gender that determines. But in Laugier's general attitude, he was close to the Mulvey idea that women have always been seen as the objects of the gaze, the male gaze of the camera, and one can, in a way, question it and subvert it, which I think has been true, is not so true today. Many things on gender transcending in many recent horror movies, Titan and others, Ducournau, would be good examples. But classically, yes, it was sort of trope, the female victim. Yeah.
Well, I think we have to leave it there, but thank you all for coming, and Jean-Michel, thank you so much for your talk. Really appreciate it.